Welcome to this video on using sources effectively. This is the fourth video in our series on research, writing and plagiarism. So to integrate sources effectively and to learn how to cite successfully, this requires an understanding of the context within which we work. Academic knowledge, more often than not, is contested. This means that in this context, people often disagree about definitions, concepts, research results, and research methods. People disagree because within universities, there is a culture of questioning, debating, and discussing the various options of knowledge. We value interrogating existing or new topics rather than merely accepting what is already known. As a result of this contestation, when we write, we are always trying to persuade others to believe in what we say. We do this mostly through writing arguments. In some disciplines, like many of the science disciplines, arguments are embedded and often look like facts. In others, like the social sciences, arguments are much more upfront and obvious. The most basic elements of an argument are a reasoned claim and evidence. We make claims which become more or less truth-like based on our evidence. And the evidence is the source of the truth in academic contexts. It's where we make decisions about what we think is true. The stronger the evidence for your claims, the more likely a reader is to buy your truths. Our evidence has to convince our audience. Audiences in academic contexts are made up of specialized communities of knowledge. Within these communities, certain evidence will be more valued than others. For example, in biology, experimental evidence is highly valued, while in education, qualitative narrative evidence is often valued. The evidence you provide needs to meet the expectations of your audience, or it won't be valued. Within academic contexts, there are two main types of evidence. The first is primary evidence, and this is the raw data collected from primary sources: interviews, surveys, experiments, observations, archival documentation, focus groups. All of those are examples of primary data. In an academic context, primary data as a source of evidence is highly valued and at the top of the hierarchy because it provides empirical proof. Of course, this isn't true for all disciplines because some disciplines don't base their research on primary data. The second source of evidence in academic contexts is published sources. So previously published research is also accepted as evidence. Published papers, books, they all count as evidence because of the peer review process. When an author submits a paper to an academic journal, the paper is sent to a couple of reviewers who are chosen because of their expertise in the field. If the reviewers accept the paper is published. If not, the paper is rejected. This vetting system carries authority in this environment and sets up this hierarchy of valued. Published sources from top international journals carry the most weight. Obscure journals or journals that are less well known provide less valuable evidence. That's not to say you can't use them, but you would have to construct an argument before using that text and explain why it's worthwhile. Most research papers tend to provide evidence as a combination of primary and published sources. Some papers, like literature reviews, are based only on published sources and use published sources as evidence. Some disciplines, like philosophy, for example, will often only use published sources as evidence. So how is referencing and evidence, how are they linked? Well, referencing is important in academic contexts because it's tied to our evidence and it's integral to your authority as an author in this environment. This is why you need to pay attention to referencing conventions, because if your references are full of errors, that sends a message to your reader about who you are as a researcher. There's a hierarchy of value to referencing and citing and citations. At the top of the pyramid are the big name gurus or key thinkers who have built their reputation on primary research and publications in respected journals or through publishing scholarly books. As gurus, they carry a great deal of authority and they don't need to reference heavily. So if you're at the top of the pyramid, you don't need to reference heavily because they've already established their authority. Faculty and researchers are in the middle of the pyramid. They are at various stages of building their reputations. They need to draw more heavily on primary research than published research, and they are often building their authority and have to tread warily between primary data and secondary sources. Doctoral students are at the gatekeeper's threshold. They are apprentices essentially and have to prove their worth in the academy. And as a result, doctoral students often are required to reference heavily on their topic and to conduct primary research. These dissertations are essentially constructed to pay homage to academic authorities, and master's dissertations follow this to a lesser degree. Right at the bottom of the pyramid are the undergraduate students. They carry the least authority in this value system. Now, these aren't rules. This is just a general guideline and it will really depend on your context. But these are often the unspoken rules or unspoken practices that you may not have understood clearly. A few more unspoken rules governing citation practices. The further down the pyramid you are, the more evidence you have to provide to make your claims more truthful and to convince your reader of your arguments. So you need to use your citations differently depending on where you are in the pyramid. Since universities are conservative institutions on the whole, the more controversial your claims, the more you are rocking the boat, the more evidence you have to provide in support. A good example of this is that if you're conducting qualitative research in a quantitative field, then you would really need to provide evidence from published sources to show why qualitative research is valuable in this field. But if you were making the same argument in a well-established qualitative area, you wouldn't have to provide that many sources. Social cleavages also affect authority in the hierarchy. Race and gender and other issues come into play and affect how much evidence you need to provide. A simple example, a woman in a male-dominated research field may have to provide more evidence than her male counterpart. So I'm not saying this is right, I'm just saying that this is how it works in practice. And there are always exceptions because I'm talking so generally here. But I'm trying to paint a picture of the kind of unwritten rules of citations. So you also need to think about the hierarchy in terms of the sources themselves. We've talked about the writers, but now let's look at the sources. At the top of the pyramid are the texts produced by gurus and authorities and researchers. So these would be, papers in leading journals, books written by gurus who are published by scholarly publishers and that have made an impact. They sit at the top. Current research is also at the top of the pyramid. Texts that have been recently published are valued because of its currency and the recency of the knowledge. Further down the pyramid, you would have less well-known journals, less well-known authors, but they're still publishing in academic journals or books. Right at the bottom, you would have non-academic texts, such as magazines, blog posts, or internet sites. Now, there's nothing wrong with these sites, but they're just not as valued as much as other texts within this context. Now, again, these are guidelines. So if you are conducting research on internet sites, then the value of internet sites would be important for you. The same thing if you were researching memoirs, then popular texts would be important for you. And if a well-known thinker in the field was writing a blog post, then you could use that as a source. So just to go over this again, sources at the top of the pyramid are peer-reviewed journal articles. They are really seen as the most important. Scholarly books, non-peer-reviewed academic journals, and then everything after that. But outdated journals and obscure book references could mean that your evidence is weak. You might get that comment, right? And recent relevant journal articles mean that your evidence is current. It's just to explain if you do get comments back on your sources. And even though this pyramid of value exists, it's not set in stone. What is valued in terms of knowledge or citations is often challenged, and it could be different in your particular context. So what does this mean for my use of sources? How can I put all of this together into my writing? It's really important to understand that in this context, we present our arguments through the voices of others. We say to our readers, although I think something, others do too. If we just said, I think something, our readers wouldn't be convinced. But by citing carefully and with this hierarchy of sources in mind, we provide our readers with evidence that will convince them. Here's an example from a paper of mine that I've written, and I'm going to read it so that you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. To understand this tension better, it is useful to visit Burford's 2017 summary of 3 conceptualizations of emotions in doctoral education research. The first way emotions are understood is to frame emotions as a problem that ought to be absent or at least carefully managed, so as not to cause a disturbance to the doctoral experience, Burford 2017. Here students are encouraged not to let emotions surface, which privileges the idea of the independent, rational scholar toiling away in isolation. Emotions are often perceived as a weakness and an obstruction to the objective knowledge of research, and there are a couple of references. A second conceptualization of emotions is a reaction to the first and constitutes a growing body of research in graduate research education. This conceptualization emphasizes that emotions are necessary in the production of doctoral subjects, Burford 2017. Emotions are the natural outcome of the processes and struggles of graduate work and should be acknowledged as such, and there's a whole spate of references. This is a recognition There is a recognition that the embodied nature of graduate writing is important, and that some experiences in the doctoral journey generate more emotions than others. The third approach to emotions is, and that's where I'm going to end it. What I want to show you here is that this topic of emotions in doctoral education is fairly controversial, and what I've done is to draw on Burford, who is somebody who's well known in this area, and use the way he has structured or used his argument to structure my argument. So I'm aligning my thinking with him. I'm saying, although I think this, Burford, somebody who knows something about this, also thinks this. and so do a number of others. So the first argument is the argument I don't agree with. The second argument is the one Burford and I agree with. And I really stack the references there because of the controversial nature. And then the third argument is, well, I won't go into that here. But what I'm trying to say is that there's been a deliberate attempt here to structure the citations, a deliberate use of citations. So research on citation use shows that there are different disciplinary differences in citation use. So in the humanities and social sciences, there are often more author-led citations than in science and engineering. But even within subdisciplines, there might be differences. So notice how authors cite in your field when you read, and think about who are you citing, why, and how. How do you want to use that citation to convince your audience? How can you use those citations to help you construct an argument? So what I really wanted to get across in this video is that to understand how to use sources effectively, we really need to understand the kinds of things that are often not spoken about in academic contexts. We tend to write arguments, and arguments include a claim and evidence. The main sources of evidence in academic contexts are primary sources and published sources. Published sources count as evidence. This is why referencing is so important. This is why the conventions and formatting of referencing are so important. Not all sources carry the same weight, so you need to think about your discipline, have a look at what you're reading, talk to people, and find out what sources are valued in your particular field. And then notice how authors cite in your field. How do they tag citations? How do they use citations? And then use citations deliberately, carefully to help you construct arguments. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you watch the other 3 videos in the series because they are all linked together, and best of luck with your writing.